How's everyone doing today? So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about SSH and then Active Directory. My name is Calvin Barber, and this is for Kennesaw State University for the class of ISA 4220 with Andrew Green. Let's get started. So a little bit of the agenda today, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about SSH, hardening for SSH, Active Directory, and hardening for Active Directory. Let's get into it. So right off the bat, we are going to be talking about SSH, and so just getting right into it, like what does SSH do? Basically, it's typically used to log in into a remote machine and execute commands, but it can also like support tunneling, forwarding, TCP ports, and also different other connections. And it can also transfer files using associated SSH file transfer or secure copy protocols. And then SSH uses the client server model. Two stages of establishment. So basically, SSH is a secure protocol, and like it's basically the most common way for safely like administering remote servers. So basically, it uses a number of encryption technologies, but a few of them, or the two stages of establishment, are SSH provides mechanism for establishing a cryptography secured connection between like two parties, and then also authenticating each side to the other, and then passing commands back and forth between the two. And then going over to negotiating the encryption of a session, basically like when a TCP connection is made by a client, the server responds with the protocol versions it supports. And then if the client can match one of these acceptable protocol versions, then the connection continues, and then the server will provide the host key, which then the client can use to check whether this was like intended by the host, whether they match. Getting into the three ways of data manipulation, you have symmetrical encryption, you have asymmetrical encryption, and then you have hashing. Basically, symmetrical encryption is a type of encryption where one key can be used to encrypt messages to the opposite party, and then also to decrypt the messages received from the other participant. Basically, this means like anyone who holds the key can encrypt or decrypt messages to anyone else holding the key. Asymmetrical encryption is just basically it is like the private key that could be kept entirely secret or should be never be shared with any other party. As the public key can be like freely shared with any party. It is associated with like the paired key and private key, and then basically like this key is a requirement for the public key paradigm to work. And then hashing. Hashing is like another form of data manipulation that SSH basically takes advantage of the cryptographic hashing. Cryptographic hash like functions are methods of creating a signature or summary of set of information, basically distinguishing attributes as they are never meant to be reversed and virtually impossible to practically be unique. Getting over to hardening of SSH, basically you want to use a public key authentication. Basically, the public key authentication is much stronger than a password authentication because it is immune to brute force attacks, but it's less convenient because it relies on RSA key pairs. And then you also want to disable password logins. You only want to have the certain people that you want to have on the SSH, not have like multiple different logins available. And then restriction of users, you can configure the SSH to permanent only certain users to log in. As I was saying before, you just want to have certain password logins and not have multiple. And then by default, all users can access SSH. And then you also want to like set up a firewall SSH. or protect the SSHs with a firewall. Basically, one of the best things you can do is to start with a perimeter and use your firewall to block access to SSH to unauthorized IP addresses. If you have like any like road warriors or anything like that, or like people trying to access your information that's not the person that you know is supposed to, you can then use like a VPN to provide secure access. Going over to Active Directory, basically, like, what does AD do, or Active Directory? It's basically domain services, which is a Microsoft directory server. It provides authentication and authorization mechanisms, as well as a framework within which other like related services can be deployed. And then like it is a compliant database that contains objects. There is multiple directory services, and within Active Directory you have domain services, lightweight directory services, and certificate services. Just a brief overview of those three. Active Directory or domain services is like a cornerstone of every like Windows domain network. It stores information like about members like of the domain, including devices and users, and then it verifies their credentials. And then lightweight directory services, basically, it like basically runs as a service on the Windows server, and then you have certificate services, which establishes on its own premises of public key infrastructure, and it can create, validate, and revoke any public key certificates from internal uses of an organization. Basically, how is Active Directory used? Active Directories are used by network administrators to simplify network maintenance processes within a large organization. Instead of like having to perform updates manually, a network administrator can update one object in a single process, which is a lot easier. And then going into domain versus forecast, forecast is a security boundary, and basically it objects any separate forecasts are not available to interact with each other unless the administrators of each separate forecast create a trust between them. And then a domain is a management boundary, which domains are a part of the forecast. The first domain in a forecast is known as the first forecast root domain, and then in many small and medium organizations, you will only like find a single domain in a single forecast. And then going over to hardening of Active Directory, you have basically, we're talking about initial break targets. Basically, these are like the most information security breaches start with like the compromise of small pieces of an organization, which is like the initial breaches. So you want to cover up any gaps in antivirus or like anti-malware deployments or incomplete patching. Just make sure to check for that misconfiguration or lack of secure application development practices. And then also going over to audit security or audit policy. Audit policy recommendations. This is like the section where you want to like be able to have audit policy settings that are recommended by Microsoft or that are set by the organization. And there are more aggressive recommendations for organizations to audit like critical servers for workstations. Like make sure that your organization is there for audit or audit policy recommendations. And then planning for compromise. So as long as you're planning for compromise, you should be like definitely better than not planning. So basically like planning for compromise will implement like controls that can detect a compromise event before the full breach has occurred, and then it can also like provide response and recovery guidelines for cases in which a complete compromise of a directory is basically achieved by attackers, which can like also lead into like defining limited and then leveraging and then implementing, isolating, and then like also simplifying for planning for compromise. these are some of the sites that I use to find this information. Very good sites. If you have any more information or any questions, you can also use these sites for your references. These are references that I used. And then also, thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks, guys.